Hi everyone. Let's go ahead and discuss some key points of an introduction to European Gothic literature. Our sources for this presentation are Robert Adams and David Stevens. The information from Stevens is actually taken from our textbook, The Gothic Tradition, pages 8 through 45. So if you're interested in this topic, or if you choose to work with it for your paper, you can go to those pages in our textbook and read a great deal more detail than I'm going to include in this presentation. Let's begin by discussing the Goths. The term Gothic refers to the Germanic tribesmen known as the Goths, who, according to historian and literary critic Robert Adams, invaded the British Isles in 455 AD. Now, the island had been under Roman rule since about 150 AD and had enjoyed the prosperity, civilization, and culture of Rome. But the Anglo-Saxons, which was the specific Gothic tribe that invaded the British Isles, were a much less civilized group. According to Adams, their invasion of what is now called Great Britain was drawn out and savage, and the Britons lost much of the comforts and of civilization that they had known under the Romans. But history from the very early years of Great Britain was passed down as tales. So 18th century historians had very little information on the Anglo-Saxons that was based on researched data instead of stories, according to literary critic David Stevens. 18th century Englishmen attributed the country's native love of freedom to the Goths, as opposed to the Normans, who invaded England and defeated the Goths in 1066. However, the fact that history was based on story rather than research led the 18th century Englishmen to combine tales of the Germanic Goths with tales of the French Normans, Stevens says. As a result, anything medieval was considered Gothic. This led the term to refer to a rather unusual combination of some of the governmental forms practiced by the Germanic Goths with the artistic creations of the French Normans. As a result, 18th century arts that are termed Gothic, such as castles, were associated with the Gothic, even though the Germanic Goths had done little building in stone, and castles were part of the architecture of the French Normans. So there's kind of a confusion in exactly which period some of these artistic forms came from. Let's take a look at how we would define the Gothic in art. Now, according to Stevens, the term Gothic as it applies to art is difficult to define because it seems to incorporate both complementary and competing ideas. Stevens says that the best approach is probably to think of Gothic art as art that represents valuing feelings and senses instead of reason, or any kind of strict artistic formula that would dictate style and approach. Artistically, the Gothic was seen in art, architecture, and landscaping before it was seen in literature, Stevens tells us. And I do encourage you to use the web to look at the artworks that are listed on page 12 of our text, The Gothic Tradition. But you certainly should look at Goya's The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters on page 11 of that text. Not only is it an excellent example of Gothic art, it also visually captures some of the concepts of Gothic thought. In architecture, according to Stevens, William Kent's work was among the best of the Gothic structures and influenced generations of architects to come. In some cases, if residents requested it, Kent would actually construct castle-like homes and abbeys that already appeared to be in ruin as soon as they were built. He even went so far as to plant dead trees. Horace Walpole who wrote the first piece of Gothic fiction, a novel called The Castle of Otranto in 1764, lived in one of these homes. But a good example of Gothic architecture that was not built to look like a ruined castle is the British Parliament building, and I also encourage you to look that up on the web and take a look at it. Turning now to literature, Stevens tells us that Gothic literature's emphasis on senses and feelings predates the same emphasis as found in the more famous and respected works of the British Romantic poets, such as Wordsworth, Shelley, Byron, and Keats. It's important to note, however, that while both Gothic and British Romantic literature focuses on feelings, the Romantic poets dealt with greater subtlety of feeling. For example, Wordsworth's poem Ode, Intimations of Immortality, presents the concept that we are born with memories of paradise that brightens everything around us when we are children, but we lose those memories of paradise as we grow up in age. Now, you've got to admit that's a much more subtle feeling than the fear of ghosts, demons, and wicked people that characterizes much of Gothic literature. But although Gothic literature is highly creative and introduced a new literary genre, Stevens says that it does borrow some elements from earlier works, such as folk tales, ballads, German literature, and respected literary works by William Shakespeare and John Milton. Let's take a look now at the political context. According to Stevens, the late 18th and early 19th centuries were characterized by widespread and very broad political changes throughout Europe. Since by strict definition, Gothic literature was part of the revival of the medieval that spanned from the 1750s through the 1820s, Gothic literature both reacted to and influenced these political changes, Stevens says. One really major historical event particularly influenced the political climate of the period. In fact, the importance of the French Revolution, which began in 1789, simply cannot be overstated. Just as a brief reminder, the French Revolution was a revolt against the monarchy led by the people, not some opposing political party or outside government, and it eventually led to the beheading of King Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette, as well as the rise of Napoleon. Now, it certainly wasn't the first populist revolt, but it was the first in Europe to lead to the execution of a reigning king, and that, of course, alarmed all the monarchies of Europe. Now, as an aside, and Stevens doesn't say this, but I should point out that the French Revolution played a major role in British literature and thinking, while the American Revolution is barely mentioned and really wasn't even considered that important to the British. Now, think about it for a minute. England was the acknowledged ruler of the seas at the time, and most of the American colonies' cities were located on the coast. Now, think this through. Do you really think that if England saw retaining the colonies as important, they couldn't have wiped out our cities with their vast, powerful navy? Of course they could have. But the minds of the rulers and the people were more focused on the unrest in nearby France that eventually led to the French Revolution and to their colonies in India and other areas that were far more profitable and therefore more important to the British at the time. It was the French Revolution, not the American Revolution, that led to a period of fast change in all areas of human activity, Stevens says. Because the questions about the nature of power in legal areas led to similar questions about the nature of family and sexuality. Now, in addition to the French Revolution, the turn of the century itself led to confusion about how to view the future, as turns of the centuries always do, Stevens says. Just as it did in 1999, The turn of the century led to views ranging from extreme optimism to absolute despair in 1799, according to Stevens. Some of those who believed that the turn of the century would be the beginning of a dark era turned to nostalgia and escapism, which of course was reacted to and influenced by the Gothic literary genre, which we call the medieval period, Stevens says. The final political factor we're going to discuss is an increase in conflict among the social classes. According to Stevens, the early 18th century saw great expansion in industry and in transportation systems. Now, those expansions led to an increasingly wealthy middle class that called for political reform. And it also influenced ambivalence towards the aristocracy, which, on the one hand, was viewed as a really fine tradition, but on the other hand, it was seen as being characterized by serious abuses. And, of course, in addition, there was tension between the middle class and the so-called laboring classes, which included the so-called unskilled workers. And those workers were the people who actually created the wealth that the aristocracy and the middle class enjoyed, Stevens tells us. Of course, I do have to take a minute to point out that those tensions that result from the division between the people who create the wealth and the people who benefit from it exist in our culture today. But the political arena was not the only one that was subject to questioning and change in England during this period. Spirituality was affected by a mounting challenge to the concept of privileging the official Christianity of the Church of England. Now, as you may recall, England was the first European country to break with the Catholic Church. In the 16th century, Henry VIII broke with the Catholic Church and established the Church of England, more or less so he could divorce his first wife, Catherine, and marry Anne Boleyn. But despite challenges to the Church of England by groups such as the Puritans, that church had remained the official church, and its doctrines were given preference, or they were privileged, in other words, over other doctrines, in a country that, remember, did not have separation of church and state. And Stevens tells us that some aspects of the rise of the Gothic were direct symptoms of this conflict. Another important factor that affected spirituality in this period was the rise of the Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment, of course, saw the discovery of the scientific method, and the promises of this new field called science led to a fascination with reason and rational thinking, and challenges to and even a loss of faith in religion. Now, Gothic writers might have seen a need to shock people out of the emotional laziness that was associated with the rise of reason, Stevens says. Also, in a more negative light, their work could be viewed as an attempt to stall or halt the progress towards reason that resulted from the Age of Enlightenment, he adds. But at any rate, while the growth of rationalism did not lead to an outright denial of the value of religion and faith, it did lead to a devaluation of the mystical dimensions of religion, Stevens tells us. Educated people of the period did believe and adhere to Christian doctrines, but they didn't believe in or experience the immediate spiritual connection to God that earlier periods encouraged. Gothic literature put people back in touch with the supernatural, Stevens says, but it presented a negative distortion of the spiritual dimension. As Luke Skywalker might say, it turned to the dark side. But Stevens said that instead of reinvigorating spiritual connections, Gothic literature might have only restored superstition and uninformed, mindless fears. While we can't be completely sure which of those effects Gothic literature had, we can see by studying the literature that Gothic literature tends to be highly critical or even damning of the topics it deals with, according to Stevens. is particularly critical of the Roman Catholic Church, which is why novels like The Monk are set in countries where Catholicism was still the privileged church instead of in England. And Stephen tells us that there's kind of an implied link between Catholicism of the period and superstition in Gothic literature. Now, Stevens tells us that while the relationship between artistic expression and the form it takes is very complex, the form isn't accidental to the concepts that are expressed in the art. The form of expression is determined by the nature of the idea it presents as well as its cultural context, Stevens says. Certainly, it is significant that Gothic literature was largely published as novels, not poetry, because at that time, poetry was regarded as true, sophisticated literature, and critics saw the emerging form of prose fiction that was presented in the novel as being definitely inferior. But while critics marginalized the novel, that wasn't the view held by the general public, Stevens tells us. Novels were particularly popular among women, and that was a rapidly growing portion of readers. In fact, according to Stevens, the existence, popularity, and growth of Gothic literature is closely tied to the growth of a female readership. Gothic novels were a form of romance, which was any story that portrayed medieval times, although the genre actually grew more out of the French tales of medieval chivalry, which would have been Norman, not Gothic. Now, according to Stevens, romance, as the term was then defined, did not necessarily deal with love or relationships between men and women, although some romances did include love stories. Early novels, including early Gothic novels, combined romance and realism, as we see in our selections from The Monk. But there was some Gothic poetry, and some novels, including The Monk, included lengthy poetic passages at the beginnings of chapters that, according to the novel, are written or sung by certain characters, Stevens tells us. Now, this inclusion of poetry is actually very appropriate in novels that recall medieval times, because in medieval Europe, stories were actually sung by bards in verse form, and there was no such thing as prose fiction such as novels, Stevens tells us. In addition, some Gothic literature was written as drama, and moreover, a very large number of Gothic novels were adapted as dramas, according to Stevens. Because only the minority of people could read, despite the rising literacy rates, dramatic adaptations of Gothic novels were highly popular and brought a great deal of fame to novelists, just like movies do now. The final point that we're going to discuss is the effect that 18th and early 19th century advances in publishing technology had on Gothic literature. According to Stevens, these technological advances led to both increased distribution to readers and the rise of circulating libraries that people could subscribe to for a fee. In some cases, publishers like Minerva Press, for example, joined with circulating libraries to increase distribution even further. And certainly these advances and the resulting growth of readership kept the Gothic novel in the public eye and helped expand their popularity. That's really all that I'm going to focus on in terms of an introduction to European Gothic literature, because we're largely going to focus on American Gothic literature. And as I said, if you would like more detail, Stevens' book, The Gothic Tradition, which of course is one of our textbooks, has a great deal more information on it. And if you have any questions, of course, email me from an account other than Canvas at deborah.okie@csn.edu. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. I hope that it helped give you a little bit of information about where horror literature came from, how it was born. So thank you again for paying attention. Email me if you have any questions, and have a great day. We'll talk again soon.